I fear not the dark itself, but what may lurk within it. Welcome to Lurk, bringing you creepy, strange, and bone-chilling stories, with your host, Jamie Jackson.
Hey Lurkers, welcome to this week's episode. This one is marked explicit because it is a true crime episode, and I think it is a little bit too much for some younger audiences, so just a heads up. Also, this is going to be a two-part episode. This week we are talking about the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, also known as the Cleveland Torso Murderer. Let's get to it, shall we? Kingsbury Run refers to an area along the east side of Cleveland, Ohio, that stretched westward through Kinsman Avenue and down to the Cuyahoga River. It also included a natural watershed that runs through East 79th Street in Cleveland, where natural creeks drain stormwater into the Cuyahoga River. In the late 1800s, the city commissioned a new sewer tunnel system project. This was constructed to pass through the Kingsbury Run area under Kinsman Avenue. The Kingsbury Run stretch of land separated Cleveland from Newburgh and became an area for railroad traffic. Industry boomed in this area, including the crude oil refinery belonging to John J. Rockefeller and the oil and naphtha works of William Halsey Doane. The boom years, however, were followed by a wave of poverty. During the Great Depression, the industry began to collapse, and Cleveland's workforce suffered. Minorities and immigrants were among the hardest hit. Many of these displaced and out-of-work people took up residence in abandoned plots of land and formed communities of their own that became known as shanty towns. One of these types of settlements formed in Kingsbury Run. The impoverished population of the area continued to grow into the late 1930s. A large wave of new residents moved in from other lakefront shantytowns as these were being removed by the city. Because of the railroad there, the area was also a place for transients known as hobos. Quick aside, when I was a kid, hobos seemed like super cool people. We talked about hobos all the time when I was younger. I might have dreamt about riding the rails like a hobo, briefly. But anyway, back to the story. It was during this time, the mid-1930s, that Kingsbury Run became notorious due to the string of murders that happened there. Kingsbury Run is still remembered today, mostly for a violent period of time in Cleveland history. Our story started September 1935, when two boys were playing around an area called Jackass Hill, when they came across the body of a man who had been decapitated. They ran for help, obviously terrified. The first Cleveland police on scene were detectives Emil Musil and Orly May. When they arrived on scene, they found not only one body, but two, and both were decapitated. The police report dated September 23, 1935, described what they found. The bodies of two white men, both beheaded, lying in the weeds. Both bodies were naked except that one of them had socks on. After an extensive search, the heads of both men were found buried in separate places, one about 20 feet away from one of the bodies, and the other head was buried about 75 feet away from the other body. Both men's penises had been severed from their bodies and were found near one of the heads. We also found an old blue coat, light cap, and a blood-stained union suit. Nearby was a metal bucket containing a small quantity of oil and a torch. It was apparent that oil, acid, or some chemical was poured over one of the bodies, as it was burnt to quite an extent. It was also evident that both bodies had been there several days, as they had started to decompose. Coroner Arthur J. Peirce described the man referred to as Victim 1 as decapitated with one testicle missing, skin tanned and leathery as from acid, dead from 7 to 10 days, homicide by person or persons at present unknown, death by decapitation, hemorrhage, and shock. He was estimated to be between 40 and 45 years old, approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, and weighing 165 pounds. His hair was dark brown. Lab analysis of the skin of victim 1 came back saying, the skin of this victim had a reddish-yellow color and was tough, hard, not unlike bacon rind. The skin was carefully washed in benzol, dried, and examined under the microscope. Nothing of importance, other than hair follicles minus the hair, was noted. It appeared as though the hair had either been shaved or burned off. The skin itself was hard and tough and very resistant to both acids and alkalis. Warm or hot water, however, caused it to swell and curl, although no difference in texture resulted. It was finally decided that scorching would produce such a condition, this, however, on dead tissue only. Examination of the contents of the bucket disclosed evidence of crankcase drainings, oil, partially decomposed human blood, and considerable black straight hair, probably human. Conclusions. Appearances, together with certain findings to indicate that this body after death was saturated with oil and fire applied. The burning, however, was only sufficient to scorch, hence the peculiar condition of the skin. The man had been decapitated while he was alive, with a sharp instrument, leaving his skin sharply cut and the muscles retracted. Advanced decomposition prevented the taking of any good fingerprints. The second body was a man in his 20s with blue-gray eyes, brown hair, and a light complexion. He was 5 feet 11 inches tall and approximately 150 pounds. He was nude except for his black cotton socks. Stomach content revealed he had eaten a vegetable meal shortly before he died. Unlike victim 1, he had only been dead 2 to 3 days. Victim 2 had also been murdered by decapitation, a very unusual way of killing someone. There were rope burns on each wrist, indicating he had been bound. Imagine being tied up and dying by having your head cut off. Not a typical way to murder someone. I'd have to say decapitation typically happens post-mortem. But that's just my personal opinion. I didn't actually look that up. Fingerprints identified victim 2 as Edward A. Andrassy, who was approximately 28 years old at the time of his death. At one time, he had been an orderly in the psychiatric ward at Cleveland City Hospital. He met a nurse at the hospital and married her in 1928, but she left shortly afterwards and bore him a daughter sometime later. When he left the hospital job in 1931, he sold magazines for a while. At the time of his death, he had no job or visible means of support. His parents were Hungarian immigrants from an aristocratic family. They were concerned about the kind of life their son led and the people he chose as associates. I think that's not unusual for parents, really, but I'm thinking they were probably right to be concerned. Obviously. His father, Joseph Andrassy, and his brother John identified the body at the county morgue. They had last seen Edward 4 days earlier. Andrassy was tall, slender, and dark-haired, a handsome man with an extremely bad reputation. He had once been arrested on a concealed weapons charge and had spent time in the Warrensville workhouse. He had also been picked up several times for intoxication. Andrassy's mother, Helen, told police that 2 months earlier, a middle-aged man came to her home and said he was going to kill Edward for paying attentions to his wife. Just before he left home for good, Andrassy had been afraid to leave his house. He had told his sister that he had stabbed an Italian in a fight and that the mob was after him. His father said that his son frequented the East 9th Street and Boulevard Road area and associated with people of questionable character. One of the detectives remembered him as a snotty punk, the kind of fellow who gives a cop a lot of lip when he's questioned. Once I had to knock him down. In the book Torso by Stephen Nichol, he summarizes some of the sordid discoveries. Andrassy had dealt in pornographic literature. He had smoked marijuana. He had gone to Detroit earlier in the summer and had been forced to leave suddenly after angering an Oriental gangster. He had been romantically involved with a married woman whose husband had vowed to kill him. Few people would have made a more likely candidate for murder than Edward Andrassy. After a few days of investigation, the police had these theories. 1. The murders were crimes of passion, not racket-related. 2. A woman will be found to have played some part in the case. 3. The victims were taken to Kingsbury Run after their deaths. 4. The two victims knew each other and were killed by the same person. 5. The unidentified man was killed first, his body immersed in some sort of fluid until the killer could trap and murder Andrassy. 6. Each victim, after his hands were tied, was executed by some sharp instrument like a butcher knife. Police were certain that each victim would have had to be carried, probably at night, down the steep embankment of Jackass Hill. Automobiles and trucks couldn't get any closer to the ravine than 100 feet from Praha Avenue. Police came up with the following timeline for Andrassy's murder. He left home on Thursday evening, September 19, 1935, not telling his family where he was going. From Coroner Pierce's report, he was killed Friday night. On Monday afternoon, his body was found. No one was ever found that had seen him after he left his home on Thursday. The police spent weeks trying to trace what happened to Andrassy that weekend, but had no luck. Police never identified the man with him, known only as Victim 1. Eventually, all clues led to dead ends, and the police activity died down. But these two murders weren't the first two. Nobody at the time tied the two odd murders to an incident a year earlier, when the lower half of a woman's torso washed up on the shore of Lake Erie, near the Euclid Beach amusement park. The legs had been severed at the knees. Coroner Pierce had estimated that the woman's bisected torso had been in the water approximately 3 to 4 months. The skin had an odd coloration that suggested the body had been scorched or treated with a chemical, perhaps a preservative. 2 weeks earlier, the upper portion of the woman's torso washed up on the shore 30 miles away, but the man who discovered it did not realize at the time it was part of a human body. The rest of her was never found. She was never identified and did not fit any missing persons report. While she was never officially considered part of the Kingsbury Run murders, she was very much unofficially considered the first in the series. The newspapers called her the Lady of the Lake, and later, Victim 0. By the November 1935 mayoral election, the city of Cleveland was tired of the growing crime that had escalated out of control. Political and police corruption had turned Cleveland into a haven for mobsters and bootleggers. Newly elected Mayor Harold Burton won on a promise to clean up the crime and rehabilitate the police force. In December, Burton started to make good on that promise by hiring Elliot Ness as safety director, which put him in charge of both the city's police and fire departments. If you think the name Elliot Ness sounds familiar, it's because he was a member of the Untouchables, members of the U.S. Treasury Department's Bureau of Prohibition. He is noted for helping to bring down mobster Al Capone. Ness launched a major attack on gambling and police corruption in Cleveland. At the time, he made plans to upgrade the caliber of rookie cops and established a modern police academy. With the dashing young Elliot Ness dominating the newspapers on a daily basis, Clevelanders had every reason to believe that crime was on the run in their city. Sunday, January 26th, was a bitterly cold day, one of several in a stretch of nasty weather the city was experiencing that winter. Butcher Charles Page, who owned the White Front Meat Market on Central Avenue, called the police to report a murder. Lieutenant Harvey Weitzel responded to the call at 11:25 a.m. and wrote, "A colored woman named Unknown informed Charles Page there was a body of a murdered person laying against a building on East 21st Place. Page stated that he investigated and found severed parts of a human body." Along with Sergeant Hogan, Detective Shibley and Detective Waxman, along with Lieutenant Weitzel, found parts of a human body at the northeast corner of the Hart's Manufacturing Company on East 20th Street. The body parts were in a half-bushel basket, and parts were wrapped in burlap sacks, along with a suit of two-piece white cotton underwear wrapped in newspapers. Joseph Sweeney, acting chief of detectives, said that the body had been placed behind the Hart's plant around 2:30 a.m. James Marco, whose home adjoins the plant, told police his dog was howling and barking at the time near the place where the basket and bags were found. The actual discovery came about later that morning from the insistent barking of a dog named Lady, who lives close to the Hart plant. The detectives presented the coroner with the lower half of a woman's torso, both of her thighs and her upper right extremity. Fingerprints from the right hand were given to the police department. Coroner Pierce determined that the woman had been dead anywhere from 2 to 4 days. Dismemberment was done with a sharp instrument like a knife. Like in the deaths of Andrassy and his unknown companion, the edges of the skin were sharply and cleanly cut. Whoever did this was very expert at cutting apart flesh. The police came back with the identity of the murdered woman. She was Florence Polillo, age 42. A moderately stout woman with a dyed reddish hair and a fair complexion. Her pleasant features reflected her Irish-American heritage. Detectives Orley May and his partner Emil Musil did an investigation into Flo Polillo's life. She had been arrested a couple of times in Cleveland and Washington, D.C. for prostitution, which was why the police had her fingerprints on file. As May and Musil investigated, a sad story unfolded. Flo was a friendly woman, liked by most people who knew her. Her landlady liked her very much, remarking that Flo had been very kind to her 3 daughters. Flo had a very extensive doll collection in her modest room, and let her landlady's girls play with the dolls frequently. But Flo had a serious drinking problem, and she became aggressive and combative when she had too much to drink. For whatever reason, she drifted into relationships that were abusive, ending up on crutches and with swollen, blackened eyes from the beatings she took at the hands of her lovers. It hadn't always been that way. In fact, she had a decent husband once. He drove from Buffalo, New York to Cleveland to give a statement to police. Andrew Polillo was a 40-year-old respectable man employed as a mailman. They were married in the early 1920s and stayed together for 6 years. Then Flo started to drink heavily and left Andrew to get herself straightened out. Instead, she drifted from man to man, resorting to temporary waitressing jobs and prostitution to earn a living. In Cleveland, her associates were whorehouse madams, prostitutes, bootleggers, pimps, drug addicts, and tavern keepers. All of them knew her, most of them liked her, but none of them had any idea what happened to her the weekend she died. There was little forensic evidence found with her body. The police traced the burlap bags in which her body was found, but nothing of value came from it. On February 7, 1936, the rest of Flo's body, with the exception of her head, was found behind a vacant house, scattered haphazardly against a fence. The cold temperatures kept the body parts well preserved. It was from the upper torso and thorax that Dr. Pierce discovered that, like the other victims, Flo Polillo had been decapitated. The muscles in her neck were retracted, which meant that the severing of her head was the cause of death. Like the investigations of the Lady of the Lake, Edward Andrassy, and identified victim number 1, the flurry of police activity surrounding Flo Polillo's murder soon died down as the clues and leads dried up. 3, and a possible 4th, decapitation, death was very unusual over an 18-month period, but nobody officially tied these murders together as the work of one killer. The Republican National Convention was coming to Cleveland the first week of June 1936, and Mayor Burton was pleased with the work Ness had done overhauling the police department and carrying out raids on organized crime. It made for positive press for the city. During the week before the Republican National Convention, Elliot Ness worked tirelessly as he personally supervised every tiny detail of the security plan for the candidates. Checking and rechecking each item in the plan, He was acutely aware that his reputation was on the line if there were any assassination attempts or violent demonstrations in the coming week. By Friday, June 5th, the delegates were starting to pour into the city to begin a weekend of caucusing and partying before the convention officially began on Monday. That Friday morning, before the convention began, 2 young boys had set off to go fishing and took a shortcut through Kingsbury Run. They saw a pair of pants rolled up under a bush, and when they poked at the bundle with their fishing poles, a man's severed head rolled out. Terrified, they ran back to the older boy's house and waited all day until his mother came home and called the police. Later that afternoon, the police found the head and began a search for the man's body. The next morning, they found the naked, headless corpse almost directly in front of the nickel plate police office, hidden in some bushes. Whoever had put it there seemed to be playing a joke on the police. The victim was a tall, slender, handsome man, estimated to be in his mid-20s. There were 6 distinctive tattoos on his body, which suggested he might have been a sailor. A cupid superimposed on an anchor, a dove under the words Helen Paul, a butterfly, the cartoon figure Jiggs, an arrow through a heart, and a standard of flags, and the initials WCG. A pile of expensive blood-stained clothing was found near the body. On the pair of undershorts was a laundry mark indicating the owner's initials were JD. Even though he was found in the heart of the hobo country within Kingsbury Run, the young man was probably not one of them. Unlike the hobos, he was clean-shaven, well-nourished, and very well dressed in almost new clothing. As the police investigated, it seemed likely the man was killed somewhere else and brought to Kingsbury Run. For one thing, there was no evidence of blood soaked into the ground near the places where the head and body were laying. The body had been drained of blood and washed clean, an impossible task in that area of Kingsbury Run. Coroner Pierce became distinctly uncomfortable when he examined the victim. I'm sure you can guess why. The latest victim had been killed by decapitation, just like the 2 men and 1 woman, and perhaps even the woman who washed up on the lakeshore back in 1934. Death by decapitation was a difficult way to murder someone, and very, very rare in the history of crime. Pierce saw a pattern emerging, even though the police wanted to ignore it. By Sunday, the day before the convention was to start, stories of a psychopathic maniac on the loose were in every newspaper. Elliot Ness quietly met with Sergeant James Hogan, his newly appointed head of the Homicide Division, and David Cowles, the head of the Crime Lab. Ness wanted Hogan, the veteran police detective, to give him the background on these decapitation murders that were filling the newspapers. Ness wanted to know if Hogan thought all the cases, including the Lady of the Lake and Flo Polillo, were connected. The veteran policeman was reluctant to voice too strong an opinion, in case Ness had an entirely different one. The deaths of the 3 men found in Kingsbury Run seemed different, Hogan said. They had all been laid out where they were sure to be discovered in a day or 2. There was a different pattern to the mutilations, too. Except for the emasculation of Andrassy and his companion, the bodies were whole from the neck down. But the 2 women, Hogan pointed out, Florence Polillo and the Lady of the Lake, had been dismembered as well as decapitated, and their bodies were not found in Kingsbury Run. Then there was the issue of motive. In the 1930s, to solve a murder, you tracked down everybody who had a motive for the killing until you had the person with the means and opportunity. The motives proposed for the Kingsbury Run double murder, whether it was jealousy, revenge, or sexual deviation, did not fit well if the victims were female. Cowles was convinced it was a single killer, but hadn't been able to get Hogan to agree. Ness agreed with Cowles that it was one person committing the murders. Ness was very clear in his instructions to the 2 men. There was to be absolutely no suggestion to the newspapers that they were looking for one murderer, and absolutely no further information whatsoever while the convention was going on. Ness had no intention of getting involved any further in this murder case. That was Hogan's job, and he was holding Hogan responsible for results. With the body of the latest victim in such good condition, plus the 6 unique tattoos, Hogan was cautiously optimistic about learning his identity. While some detectives checked fingerprint files and recent missing person reports, others took the young man's photo to tattoo parlors and sailor hangouts. The face and tattoos received even more exposure on display at the morgue. 2,000 people looked at him the first night, and thousands more after that. Detectives put in countless hours of footwork, checking out the laundry marks and tracing the clothing they found. A death mask, along with photographs of his face and tattoos, were exhibited to the 7 million visitors who came to the Great Lakes Expo over the next 2 years. In spite of all that effort, the tattooed man remained nameless. Shortly after the convention was over, the city was swept up in the glamour of the Great Lakes Exposition, which was a combination of World's Fair and super amusement park. After the misery of the Depression, it was an excellent diversion offered at a price where even the poor could enjoy the shows. There was even a police exhibit designed by Elliot Ness, showing the latest methods in fighting crime, along with the death mask of the tattooed man. The police department was still working on the murder of the tattooed man when on July 22, 1936, a call came in to the homicide detectives about another murder. Sergeant Hogan went over to the Big Creek area on the southwest side of the city, where a teenage girl stumbled upon the headless corpse of a white man near a hobo camp. The report stated, "The dead man was lying on his stomach in the nude, and the head was partly wrapped up in his clothing about 15 feet north of the body. It appeared that the body had been lying at this point for at least 2 months and was very badly decomposed." The police conducted a thorough search of the area and found the man's head, which was little more than a skull at that point. Close by was a pile of cheaply made, blood-stained clothes, which the man had been wearing. The pathologist discovered a large quantity of dried blood that had seeped into the ground beneath the man's body, indicating he had been killed right there. Coroner Pierce noted that the body was in an advanced state of decomposition, with skin and flesh denuded in large areas. Rodents, maggots, and the process of decomposition had removed portions of the internal viscera. The head had been separated from the body at the junction of the second and third cervical vertebrae, the ends of which bones showed no evidence of fracture. The expert decapitation had become almost a signature of this particular killer, but this murder was somewhat different. For the first time, the murderer had gone across town from Kingsbury Run, and instead of transporting the victim, the murderer killed him in the place he was discovered. The dead man, a small fellow about 40 years old, had been laying on the ground between 2 and 3 months, indicating he died before the tattooed man. Hogan then had no choice but to agree that these decapitation murders were the work of one man, but he had no intention of sharing this belated insight with the press. Advanced decomposition made fingerprinting impossible, so the police had only his clothes to trace him. The victim's long hair, his poor clothing, and the location of the body near a hobo camp suggested he was one of the many hobos who rode in and out of the city on the nearby railroad tracks. Hogan did his best to conduct his investigation without attracting too much attention from the newspapers, but his success was limited. The story had already gotten their attention. One article read, "Is there somewhere in the county a madman whose strange god is the guillotine? Or has some fantastic chemistry of the civilized mind converted him into a human butcher? Does he imagine himself a legal executioner of the French Revolution, or a religious zealot saving the human race with an axe?" was representative of the rhetoric that had started to appear very prominently in all of the city's 3 newspapers. These early seeds of hysteria didn't take root because there were many more exciting things going on in the city at that time than the death of a few losers and minor criminals. In quick succession, Ness and his men conducted 10 more high-profile gambling raids. The newspapers couldn't get enough of it. Almost every story carried more bad news for mob vice operations. Police protection of gangsters was crumbling, and the mobs were considering moving out of Cleveland as long as Ness was there. The spotlight was once again on Kingsbury Run, where on September 10th, a hobo sat near East 37th Street, waiting for an eastbound freight. There, in an oily, coffee-colored stagnant pool, he saw two halves of a human torso floating in the water. Detective Orley May responded, accompanied by Detective Emil Musil. We learned that the torso was discovered by Jerry Harris of St. Louis, and who was sitting on the pier alongside the creek, who noticed the two pieces of the torso, who then notified the police. The torso was then removed from the creek and was sent to the county morgue. A search was immediately begun alongside of the creek and the weeds for the balance of the body. The fire rescue squad was then called and the creek was dragged with grappling hooks with a view of recovering the remainder of the body in the outlet of this creek, which comes out of a tunnel at this point, at which point the body was dumped over and small portions of flesh were found on the ledge where the torso struck when it was thrown over the edge into the creek. We were unable to recover any portions of the body with the grappling hooks, so we proceeded in using sealing hooks and we recovered 2 legs below the knee. We then continued to search further and recovered the right thigh. I then searched the woods and picked up a gray felt hat, rather dirty, which appeared to have bloodstains on the top, and a small black band which had the label Laudie's Smart Shop, Bellevue, Ohio. A blue work shirt was found wrapped in newspaper along the bank of the creek, where the body was thrown into the creek. The shirt was covered with blood. Hundreds of morbidly curious spectators crowded around to watch the cops drag the pool for the victim's head. The hysteria was growing among the people who lived in small, clapboard homes perched on the rim of Kingsbury Run. The papers had already found a name for this fiend, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. The coroner, who confirmed that death occurred a day or two earlier by expert decapitation. The victim this time was a white man between 25 and 30 years old, medium height and muscular build with traces of light brown hair on his body. That night, the sergeant and 12 of his detectives stayed up very late trying unsuccessfully to match the victim's description with missing persons files. The next morning, the gruesome discovery was still the major front page story when divers descended into the murky depths of the pool looking for the head and hands that might give some hope of identifying the young man. The number of spectators had multiplied from the day before, standing for hours watching the hunt. After 2 hours of high-pressure flushing by fire hoses failed to bring up any other parts of the body, Hogan called in the Coast Guards to use their special equipment to drag every inch of the rubbish-covered bottom of the pool. The following morning, an irritable Elliot Ness pulled himself away from his research into police corruption and got personally involved in the Kingsbury Run case. Unfortunately, he couldn't ignore the case anymore. It had become too big to delegate to Hogan alone. Once again, Ness went over every detail of the case, personally interviewing several of the detectives who had been working on it. Then he ordered a cleanup of the section in Kingsbury Run where the bodies had been found. Every hobo in that area was brought in and questioned, warned about the killer, and urged to find somewhere else to live. 20 detectives were permanently assigned to the case until it was solved, although with the meager clues, it wasn't at all clear what 20 full-time detectives were going to do after they interviewed all the bums in the area. Detectives were inundated with calls about the strange behavior of the neighbors, relatives, and co-workers. Anybody who kept unusual hours, carried large packages out of his house, or kept a knife in his pocket was fair game, not to mention every butcher, physician, male nurse, mortician, and hunter. The worst of it all was that Elliot Ness said every tip, no matter how trivial it sounded, must be followed up. The detectives estimated it would take months, maybe years to finish. Following up tips was not the only thing the detectives did. They repeatedly scoured the records of the state hospital for the insane, as well as followed and watched recently discharged patients. Detective Orley May reported on a tip that was typical of the thousands of tips the police department were given. Detective Musil and I received information from a person who does not want her identity revealed, and who stated that while she was in the workhouse, a woman by the name of Helen O'Leary, who was the former wife of a man who was shot and killed several years ago, and who since got married to Gas House O'Malley, a stagehand, told her that she knew a man that killed Florence Polillo. She asked him who it was, and she said, "You know his name is Jack Wilson." They also tried some unorthodox methods. Detectives dressed as hobos hid in the bushes of Kingsbury Run looking for suspicious characters. Other detectives hung around gay bars and steam baths trying to get leads on homosexual men with sadistic tendencies. It's hard to imagine any of the detectives posing convincingly as either a hobo or a homosexual, but they did try. At least one detective was beaten up by someone who saw through his disguise. The head of the Federal Narcotic Bureau in Cleveland told the detectives that it was most likely a marijuana addict committed the murders. There's a plentiful supply of this deadly weed growing wild around the railroad tracks in Kingsbury Run. Both the desire for a thrill and a homicidal obsession are easily induced by the loco weed cigarettes. I'm not even going to comment. A few days after the murder, the Cleveland News offered a $1,000 reward, quite a sizable amount for those days, for information leading to the conviction of the Kingsbury Run murderer. The Cleveland City Council was also voting on a resolution to offer a similar reward. The newspapers in the Midwest became obsessed with the cleverness of the killer. The lack of clues left by the killer was not accidental. There was never a coin, a key, or a scrap of paper to incriminate him, nor were there any bloody fingerprints on the bodies. It seemed to the detectives that the killer was playing a game with them, leaving so many bodies in the same area, especially when the railroad police, hobos, and Kingsbury Run inhabitants had been on the lookout for strange happenings since the very first double murder a year earlier. When the body of the tattooed man was placed so close to the office of the Nickel Plate Railroad Police, was the killer taunting them? It was clear that the murderer was very smart, possibly smarter than the detectives working on the case. The newspapers let their imaginations run wild when they speculated about the motives of this unusual killer. One imaginative theory was that the murderer was a wealthy doctor who killed people from the lower classes for sport. Then there was the religious zealot notion, which had the murderer ridding the world of prostitutes and homosexuals because God told him to. One popular theory proposed that the killer was an otherwise normal person who killed only during occasional lapses into madness. Typical of the language that saturated the newspapers at the time was the editorial in the Cleveland News. Of all the horrible nightmares come to life, the most shuddering is the fiend who decapitates his victims in the dark, dank recesses of Kingsbury Run. That a man of this nature should be permitted to work his crazed vengeance upon 6 people in a city the size of Cleveland should be the city's shame. No Edgar Allan Poe in his deepest opium-maddened dream could conceive horror so painstakingly worked out. Elliot Ness knew that this murderer was no ordinary one. It was time to bring together a group of experts to share information, so he invited Coroner Pierce and Dr. Reuben Strauss, the pathologist who had performed many of the autopsies of the victims, County Prosecutor Colleton, Police Chief Matowitz, Lieutenant Cowles, Inspector Joseph Sweeney, Sergeant Hogan, and several outside medical consultants. After a number of hours, the group agreed on what they knew about this killer. One man working alone murdered all 6 victims. The Lady of the Lake, who was most likely an earlier victim of the same serial killer, was not included in official count because the murder happened in 1934, a full year before the death of Andrassy. This killer, while clearly psychopathic, was probably not obviously insane. There was disagreement as to whether the killer was a male homosexual, considering the genital mutilation of the corpses. Some of the non-genital mutilation may have been done to thwart identification or to make it easier to transport the body. Other mutilations seemed to have no clear purpose. While they all agreed that the killer had some knowledge of anatomy, the medical experts felt there was no evidence to establish that the murderer was necessarily a physician. After all, a butcher or hunter would recognize anatomical landmarks almost as well as a surgeon. The murderer was both large and strong. The experts had pretty well discounted that any female could be a suspect in this murder series. The nature of the wounds, plus the fact that at least 3 of the male victims were carried a considerable distance, argued for a very large man. The murderer was very likely to be a resident of the Kingsbury Run area. With the exception of the 5th victim, who was found on the west side, all of the victims were found in Kingsbury Run, or the near east side. Considering how untidy it is to decapitate a living person with the jugular veins spurting blood in all directions, the experts agreed that the killer had some kind of private place where the victims were dispatched and later cleaned up. Theories ranged from a butcher shop, a doctor's office, or even a home where unsuspecting victims were lured by the promise of food or shelter. The killer selected his victims from the lowest rungs of society. Whether that selection fulfilled some need to eliminate the undesirables of the city, or just that there were so many from that social stratum in ready supply, was not determined. Most of the experts believed that it was no accident that of the 6 victims, only 2 were identified, and those were among the earlier ones, Andrassy and Polillo. To the veteran homicide officials, it indicated that the murderer was getting smarter. Heads and hands were either gone or too decomposed for identification purposes. Even when highly distinguishing marks appeared on the body, such as the tattooed man, nobody came forward to claim these victims as missing persons. The evidence was building that the more recent victims were being selected for anonymity. Another unique characteristic of these crimes was the choice of Kingsbury Run as the graveyard. 4 out of 6 victims were found in that godforsaken ravine. The tattooed man was placed embarrassingly close to the Nickel Plate Railroad police office, as though the killer was playing a joke on them. And on that note, we're going to end this episode here and pick up next week with part 2. Remember, you can find Lurk wherever you listen to podcasts, and at lurkpodcast.com, where we have all of our episodes, along with links to our social media. If you're interested in more content and supporting the show, consider becoming a Lurk patron for just $5 a month on Patreon. The link is in the show notes. And until next time, keep lurking.